So is Russell against democracy? I guess is a question that we are faced with when we read, especially this first essay, The Need for Political Skepticism. He says in the beginning that um, we have a kind of fatal faith in political parties. We believe that if only our political party was in control, that everything would be better. And he says this is a delusion that we suffer under, because the problem is not whether or not one or the other political party is in control. The problem is political parties themselves. That as long as we have political parties in the form that we do, we'll never really get anywhere. He kind of pays this off on page 131 when he says, we have thus two conditions which must be fulfilled by the measures on which party politicians lay stress. One, they must seem to favor a section of the nation. And two, the arguments for them must be of the utmost simplicity. So in a democracy where you actually have to gain the approval of at least a large part of the populace to get anything passed, to get anything done, there are two structural obstacles then that are put in the way of good government. One is sectionalism, that is the idea that, which Russell returns to again and again in his essays, is that the human beings have a passionate desire to blame others, and to punish their enemies. So um, party politics has to appeal to a section, a part of the national population, and it does so by demonizing some other part. And this can't help but be harmful. And the second obstacle, the second structural problem of democracy is that to actually get anything done, you have to convince a large section of the people that it's right. But the only way to do that, people being what they are, is to have in favor of those policies arguments of the utmost simplicity. But we don't live in a simple world. We live in a complex world. So there are problems, according to Russell, that politicians have a certain skill, and that skill is in anticipating what people will think in general and being able to persuade people to think certain things, not necessarily a talent or an ability to recognize what is the public good. The way that Russell describes politics, that's more or less not only useless to do, but fatal for a politician to do. To insist on the public good when that's not really their job. Their job is to appeal to basically to people's prejudices. The expert opinion is something entirely different. As he says on page 132, the expert, as opposed to the politician, is a curiously different type. As a rule, he is a man who does not aim at political power. His natural reaction to a political problem is to inquire what would be beneficial rather than what would be popular. And Russell recognizes that, Russell's point is that, especially in the modern world, we should listen to more to experts, but that experts have their own weaknesses, their own defects, and he lists them. That experts tend to overemphasize the importance of their specialty. That experts don't understand the way politics works, so they don't recognize the need to actually convince people of policies in order for those policies to be beneficial. There's all sorts of problems with experts, and he even admits on page 134, he says probably most experts do not realize that if they had executive power, that is, if the experts were really in control, their impulses towards tyranny would develop, and they would cease to be the amiable and high-minded men they are at present. That is, that there's a tension between democracy and technocracy, or rule of the experts. So, as conclusion, for all these reasons, we cannot escape from the evils of our present politicians by simply handing over the power to civil servants. Nevertheless, it seems imperative in our increasingly complex society that experts should acquire more influence than they have at present. Well, it's a very interesting thought because, of course, it doesn't present any kind of easy answer. On the one hand, a rule by experts would probably turn into something like a tyranny. On the other hand, because of the kind of world we live in, and we can look at the present crisis with COVID-19, the world stands in need of experts in a way it never did before. Global warming, nuclear weapons, economic problems. So, one could say, what is the answer to all this? And I think, interestingly enough, this leads to maybe the second essay here, because I think the answer is free thought. That is, Russell does not believe in some kind of revolutionary change. He's not a communist. He's not some kind of right-wing revolutionary. He's what he would consider to be a moderate and reasonable man. And I suppose that what he's ultimately saying is that the only way that we can mitigate the problems of democracy is through an enlightened public. It's a very interesting essay, this essay about free thought. He sees two basic barriers to free thought in modern societies, and they're not legal barriers. They're economic and, you could say, cultural barriers that people are dissuaded from having dissenting beliefs. From free thought, because they're afraid, on the one hand, of being punished. That is, if their thought is too heterodox, if it's too different from the norm, then they're afraid of not being able to get a job. They're afraid of being ostracized. But the other is their education. That we are not actually taught to be free thinkers. We're taught to accept certain things as being true without evidence, and that our education fails us. He rather unfairly contrasts himself with the American philosopher William James here on page 151. James has this wonderful essay called The Will to Believe, which Russell probably doesn't really understand. But he contrasts James's will to believe with what he calls the will to doubt. As he says, "For my part, I should wish to preach the will to doubt. None of our beliefs are quite true. All have at least a penumbra, an aura, a shadow of vagueness and error." That is, to be a skeptic. But how do you teach people to be skeptics? How do you teach them to think for themselves and to demand evidence instead of just believing things without evidence? Well, I suppose it's really about teaching people to be grown-ups, teaching people to not accept things not accept things purely on the basis of authority, like we do when we're children. I don't know. How do you do that? What kind of education? I think in America there has been a long-standing attempt to teach people to think for themselves, and it's really not that easy, is it?